Thank you all for being here for tonight's program. My name is Michelle Stepien, and I'm the Executive Director of the Holland Museum. And we're excited to welcome Professor Michael Douma back to Holland and back to his alma mater. Michael has done 2 programs for the Holland Museum in the past couple of years, but they were always on Zoom. So when he reached out to me last summer and described his new book, I knew this talk needed to be in person. But we would need partners and financial supporters to make this night happen. So I want to extend my thanks to Lauren Stevens, Curator of Learning and Community Engagement in the Holland Museum, Professor Jean Petit, and the Hope College Department of History, and Caitlin Ramirez and Audrey Rojo of the Zeeland Historical Society for their partnership support and oversight of all of the details to make this evening happen. And I'm especially grateful to Howard Venneklausen for his sponsorship of this program and his continuing support of the Holland Museum. First, a couple of housekeeping items. We ask that you please silence your cell phones. And we also, there's information on the back table. We hope you'll help yourself. Information about the Holland Museum and the Zeeland Historical Society's upcoming events and programs. And we look forward to seeing you at both museums soon. So now please welcome Professor Jean Petit, Chair of the Hope College Department of History, who will introduce our special guest.
Thank you, Michelle. We also, in the History Department, are very pleased to partner with the Holland Museum and the Zeeland Historical Society for this talk. And we are especially pleased to welcome Michael Douma from our student back, class of 2004, back to Hope. I never had the pleasure of teaching Michael, but I remember hearing as a little archive grad student who just really was into Dutch American history, and we kept wanting to have Michael come back to visit us. He graduated from Hope, as I mentioned, in 2004 and earned his PhD at Florida State University in 2011. He's currently an associate professor at Georgetown University's Business School, where he teaches courses on economic history of slavery and globalization. He's authored numerous books and articles, a lot of them on Dutch and Dutch American history, some notable ones, How Dutch Americans Stayed Dutch, A Historical Perspective on Ethnic Change. That's your first book, right? Yeah. And then one I found really impressive. It's such kind of a, even though it's similar to Dutch history, it's such a different kind of topic. The colonization of freed African Americans in Suriname, and archival sources relating to U.S. and Dutch negotiations, 1860 to 1866, a kind of a Civil War era examination of U.S.-Dutch relations, which was just fascinating. He has also published books beyond just Dutch American history, books and articles that examine historical thinking and the liberal arts, as well as business history. One struck me, a 2022 article in the American Institute of Economic Research titled, "What the hell is inflation anyway?" No more relevant these days. But tonight, we're really pleased to welcome Michael back to give a presentation that has the same title of his new book, The Slow Death of Slavery in Dutch New York. Thank you.
Make sure this is on. I think everyone can hear me fine. I don't really hear this. Is it good? You want it up? Yeah, I'm not hearing this. This is on. Our tech left us. Maybe just move this up. There we go. Maybe a little bit. I'll do my best to use this. All right. A lot of you, of course, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens as the author novelist. But he was actually more famous in his time for being a speaker. And he would go around on these Chautauqua tours, and people would come out and see him. And he would memorize his speeches and speak extemporaneously, in Latin. And this was, for a lot of these 19th century audiences, a real relief, because that was the era. There we go, I think it's coming up now. That was the era in which you had people that would read speeches for 3 hours. I have some colleagues. This is really loud now. I have some colleagues. It's the traditional English and British method, to still read your lectures. I don't do that. I feel, especially with this, I spent 5 years writing this book. If I need notes or reminders about what I said, I have bigger problems because I thought about this book, probably read it myself 200 times as I was editing the book and working through it. I think we're at a good level now with this. Squeaking. Maybe if I get away from that. That might be it. There's some feedback. Is that better? Okay. All right. So let me introduce the topic to you. I'm sorry. In as broad of sense as possible to get everybody on board. A lot of you are aware, may not be, but a lot of you are aware that New Amsterdam, or New York, used to be called New Amsterdam, and that the Dutch settled in New York and had a colony in the colonial period that ended in 1664 when the English took over. When I mention the Dutch in New York, that's often what people think of. They think of New Netherland. But New Netherland was really kind of small in the scheme of things. There was about 9,000 people at its demise, and there was about 600 slaves in New Netherland. When New Netherland was taken over, the Dutch didn't disappear. They stayed in Manhattan, but they moved also to Long Island, to the Hudson Valley. They spread everywhere, and they continued to speak Dutch for 200 years. They preserved their language longer in New York than the Dutch in the Midwest did. And they developed their own sort of culture and ideas. So I got interested, sorry about this. I got interested in this story. Yeah, I think we're okay now. I got interested in this story because it connected various things I was interested in. I wrote a dissertation on Dutch American immigration. Spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, I learned Dutch. Ik kan Nederlands spreken, met Nella, and a few other people in here I could speak Dutch with. And I started reading some of the books on New York slavery, and when they mentioned the Dutch, they would say things like a few slaves, or some. And that's the historian's way of saying, I don't have any idea how many there were. Right? There was a few there and a few over there. Are we talking hundreds, thousands? Like, we don't know. Right? And so you'll see in my title of the book, this next page, yeah, stay away from that speaker. You gotta stand right there. There should be an X. You'll see in the title of my book that it's a demographic, economic, and cultural history. And demography is actually the key here. Demography is the study of populations and how populations change over time. It's primarily a modern discipline. I didn't have any expertise in it. It's similar to statistics or finances in a way that you measure the flow of population. And a lot of historians are content to merely cite the census, to assume that the census records are accurately taken, and then to assume that the books that report them are accurate as well, because errors can be introduced into the system anywhere you go. And so my first thing to do was to try to answer the question, how many Dutch slaves were there in New York? How can we write about something if we don't even know the numbers? Right? A few years before that, I had done some other work with numbers, quantitative history. And it's too bad Bob Swearick isn't here, because he's one of the pioneers of quantitative computer history in the 1970s. And when I talk about these old historians of slavery that I'm reading, Bob always tells me, oh yeah, I had dinner with him, and we used to hang out at these conferences and things like that. So he's great to know. And so the important thing then is to look at the numbers. And so in the earlier research I had done, I had a co-author on an article on something similar to this. And he said to me, shouldn't we have a footnote that explains our method? Like, what are we doing here as quantitative historians? And I responded to him very bluntly, it's called counting. I simply counted things. And I could explain it on the bottom and say my method is counting. But people think you need to do something fancy to do something new. Not necessarily. You just need to apply basic knowledge, basic understandings, and dig deeper So I was actually pleased to be called an archive rat. First time I've been called a rat. Because I worked 4 years right over there. The archives are not back right over there, and I went down there today for the first time in 15 years. It was kind of weird. And so I looked at the census. Of course, the U.S. Census comes every 10 years. 1790 is the first U.S. Census. There's questions about how accurate it is. You can read article after article about it. The colonies of the United States all did their own colonial censuses. So there was, or sometimes I say censi, right, the Latin colonial census. And different colonies had them in different years. There's no consistency. It's hard to know how accurate they are. But New York, fortunately, had more censuses than any other colony. I think it's something like 12 in the 18th century. And conveniently, one in the year 1703, so I could sort of use that as a bookmark. And then, of course, 1800, the second U.S. Census. And so I focused only on the 18th century, and I started measuring things, counting things. And so let me start with this first section. I'll come back to these questions, sorry about that. This is the first section I want to show you. I can't step over that. I started doing simple just graphs and charts to try to get a picture of what's going on. And so this is in New York State. And this is your total number of Black people, African American people, the total number of slaves or enslaved people in New York over time. These are not co-equal. There are always in early America some free blacks. And where they diverge is where slavery starts disappearing from New York and being emancipation in the state starts happening. And so these are the totals just based on what the census tells us. That's sort of step one, right? But you have to subdivide things. If you look at things in different regions, you start understanding the picture in different ways. Most New Yorkers, most historians of New York, think that you're talking about New York City. But there's a whole state that's attached to New York City that's often neglected. Yeah. And people think that slavery in New York and in the North is an urban city phenomenon where you had servants serving rich people. This is something that I try to totally overturn in this book. Slavery in New York is mostly rural. It's mostly in the Hudson Valley and in Long Island. It's not rich people. It's not domestic servants. It's field workers working in the wheat industry for the Dutch, largely for the Dutch. So here's the slaves in New York City themselves, and you see that goes down over time. It's a small percent. And then you can look at, okay, so this is New York City, total population, total blacks. This is emancipation when you start moving into the city. But you can look at it in other regions. So I broke it into Long Island and Staten Island as like a region. You see this is kind of stable, it goes down. But the Hudson Valley is the more interesting one. This is largely the growth of Dutch-speaking slaves in the Hudson Valley over time. And so when you disaggregate that census data into regions, you see some interesting patterns. And then you can put it all back together again and compare them. So here you have New York City in blue, Long Island, Staten Island in orange, and the Hudson Valley in gray, and so more slaves in the Hudson Valley than the other two combined. Now, the next step was to look at these regions and try to figure out how much were those regions Dutch? How much did they speak Dutch? And there's various ways to do this. One is from runaway slave advertisements. I'll talk about those a little bit later. There's letters, references from people traveling around the state. There's census reports, early census reports that get at ethnicity, and later historians are trying to dig into it. Using all these to sort of triangulate the problem, I came up to an estimate, I think a conservative estimate, that at least 40% of the slaves in New York spoke Dutch. And this is surprising to many people, because this they think of as the English period. The Dutch period was before New Netherland passed away and it disappeared. But the percent of slaves in New York that spoke Dutch was stable, and the total number of slaves that spoke Dutch in the state probably increased. There we go. That's this one. probably increased throughout the 18th century. So the story gets more and more relevant. There's more and more slaves later in the story in the 18th century. This is not a 17th century story. Okay. Let me think. Anything else I want to tell you about demography? Oh yeah, so 40% of the slaves in New York spoke Dutch. I had help from a finance professor to create all these calculations. This is probably the fancy word. It was called an imputed linear graph or something, where we took all the census data, we took all of the slave import numbers, we took assumed birth rates, assumed death rates, we created ranges for those in the variables, we measured all these things, and we came up with potential estimates for the total number of slaves in New York over time. So like this would be a minimum number if the birth rate was this, and this is the maximum number if the imports were this, right? And we created all these things. And the range, I think the total number in New York throughout the entire 18th century was, well, let me tell you, the Dutch number is 22,000. So there's 22,000 Dutch-speaking people in New York enslaved that at one point or another in the 18th century lived in the state. It's roughly 40% of the population. So that's the demographic base for this story. Once you know that, you're like, oh, this is a bigger story. In fact, the Dutch-speaking slave population in New York is, in my opinion, the largest non-English speaking or foreign language speaking population of slaves ever in the United States. It's bigger than the number of French in Louisiana. You might find some other groups elsewhere that competed at this, but I haven't found the numbers. Historians don't do the demography to tell you in these other places what they are. So it doesn't say it in the book, but I believe it. The editor kind of pushed back on that one. I take it out. You can't claim more than you can prove, you know? So, all right. So it's a bigger story, it's rural, it's in the countryside, it expands over time. It's not just a story of English speakers in New York City. Now, another part of the book is the economic part. What were all these slaves doing? I mentioned to you that they're working in the wheat industry. But why, right? One of the standard interpretations of American history and slavery is called the staple interpretation, by which they mean the staple crops. And when I teach world slavery or something, I tell this sort of basic story. Sugar is what brought slavery to the New World, to the Caribbean. Tobacco is what brought slavery to Virginia. Cotton is what caused slavery to spread across the South. And that explains a lot of things. It's a materialist explanation, but it works. Wheat, however, seems like the quintessential free farmer crop. That you would plant it, and you'd have the yeoman farmer come along with his scythe, cut it down, bring it to the mill. Why do you have slaves for that? You know the wheat cutting season is 3 weeks long in New York. What are you going to do the rest of the time with all these workers, right? And so to get to the economics of it, I had to read a lot and think about things. One is this. In New York, the currency for the longest period of time in New York history is not the dollar. Well, maybe now it's the dollar. It wasn't, in the beginning it was wampum, Ceylon, the pearls, but it was actually wheat for a longer period of time. So rents were paid in wheat. People calculated, is this the right one? Yeah, the minister's salary, paid in wheat in Kingston, named Wigston. And this is one example of one of the Dutch language sources in New York that I found. All right. This is another one. When people, there's ranges of literacy. You can't read or write at all. You can write your name. This is a mark. So some people had a sign, they would just do an X. Some people had a symbol for the name. This guy had a scythe. Being heavily invested as a weirdo historian, one year, a couple years ago, I decided to grow grain myself. I ordered a pound of wheat in the mail, plowed my field, planted an eighth of an acre of wheat. I have a scythe, I own land, cut it with the scythe. I flailed it with an old wooden flail, I sifted it with an electric fan, blowing through it, took out all the little bits, put it in a coffee grinder, and made flour. 100% whole grain flour. You make a loaf of bread with that, you're going to break your teeth. So you have to cut it with 50% processed flour, and you can make some really hard banana bread that was the equivalent of $600 a loaf. If you count my labor at $15 an hour, right? It shows you how much work is involved in processing wheat. And so the slaves, why they were necessary, why they were necessary in New York, and why they were used, is because I think they solved something called the peak labor problem. I told you the wheat harvest is only 3 weeks long. But if you plant wheat, you really need laborers in those weeks, and you can't get them because everybody is working in the summer, and the price of wages goes up like 3 times in the summer in this era, in July or August. And so having slaves meant that you had a guaranteed workforce to be there during the peak labor season when you really needed them. And this is why they preferred slaves rather than free wage laborers that they could just buy in the market, because they couldn't find people at a certain wage to do this work. Right? It's always a moral choice. It's not like it's economically better to do this or that. It's also a choice about what you want to do. How much are you willing to pay a free worker? How much are you willing to buy a slave for? And they found it easier to buy a slave. Now, the rest of the year, these slaves would mill the grain, bring it to market, process it. But they also did lots of other things. They would have to tend fences, look after cows, do all sorts of other work. And so slavery in New York, in my view, is much more diverse in labor than it was in the South. So if you take your average slave in the South, they're going to be spending half of the year working on one thing: picking cotton, rolling tobacco, drying tobacco, something like that. In New York, they're doing lots of different work. As long as they break even during the year, it's fine, because they're going to profit from wheat, from flour. Right? This is the big product in New York. So there's 2 images. This is where they're from. I'm not much of an art historian, but it's a perspective on history. This lesson is about tools. My first tool is demographic history. Second tool is economic history. Art history is another tool. If you know art and really look at it, you can find things. This was a clear example. This is a painting of a farm. I think it's in Brooklyn. And then it's repainted 20 years later. And it's repainted after the anti-slavery movement starts. And they started erasing the African-American slave from their family history in the second picture. So you can see, but it's kind of hard to see, but he's in the red shirt there. And this one, he's in the white shirt, turned away, and now his race is ambiguous, because you can't see him properly. New York likes to think of itself as a free state. But there were slaves until 1827, and children of slaves indentured into service until the 1840s, so much longer than we often thought. All right, and then with economics, you get into slightly more technical things. This isn't a big deal. This is another example of me counting. I really love the online newspapers.com databases, Redex newspaper databases. I spent like a month going through these things, and I took quarterly readings of the price of wheat and flour in the New York markets. What's fascinating, though, is that the New York newspapers always had the price of wheat and flour on the front page, which shows that this was a very important thing for businessmen to know, to calculate this, because all business revolves around wheat and flour in one way or another. And by measuring those values quarterly, so you don't want to spend your time counting all 52 weeks of the year and putting them all in there, you just take a few readings. And over time, I created this chart. And I like to ask my students, and I guess I can ask the audience, against their own I can ask the audience here, why is the price of flour shooting up where it is? The American Revolution. So New York City gets controlled by the British. Price of flour shoots through the roof. And it's much more volatile in this later period for various reasons. You have the introduction of more mechanical milling and all sorts of things. You have bigger markets and shipping of the wheat and flour to the Caribbean and elsewhere. So there's all sorts of possible things. You can do really a whole lesson just on this graph. I mean, talking about every up and down and why it matters. But the important thing here is that you see that the price of wheat continued to go up. This is important if you understand why the Dutch kept slaves as long as they did. Because I later discovered, I believe, that the Dutch in New York held on to their slaves much longer than the English slave owners in New York did. And that's because they were conservative wheat farmers, and the price of wheat kept going up after the American Revolution. So they're like, just one generation more, right? And then we'll let it go. But they wanted to hold on as long as possible to get this profit and growth in the industry. And I also believe that had slavery not ended in New York for political reasons, economically it could have moved west. Just like slavery moved west in the South, in the Middle States. It could have moved with the Erie Canal westward. And eventually, the Midwestern farmers outproduce the New York wheat growers, and wheat disappears from New York, right? Like, you don't think of the rolling wheat fields of New York anymore. Now it's all in Kansas and other places. This is part of the process of the development of wheat from east to west, from slave to free. Another part of the economic story, in most of the literature, the economic history of slavery. In fact, the entire sub-discipline of economic history is really built on the study of slavery. There's a famous article from the 1950s or 60s about slave prices. I might mention that in a minute. There's a lot of work in the 1970s, and that's called Cleometrics, which is, Cleo is the muse of history, and it's sort of this cute term for economic study of history. And so I thought that the best way I could contribute to the understanding of slavery was to find values of things. Because the big questions they've always asked is, was slavery efficient? Did it make sense economically, financially? Right? Like, we know it was bad morally, but did it work financially? Who benefited? Who didn't? And so I measured prices. And this is probably one of the more obsessive parts of the research. There was no collection of slave prices in New York and New Jersey. So I traveled to a dozen archives in New York. I scoured the web and every database and website that I could, and I created my own database. I think I'm now close to 4,000 slave sales in New York and New Jersey that were recorded that I have in our database. And it's coded by name, age, gender, race, obviously, county, location, price, in pounds or in dollars. Right? So British or New York pounds or dollars, so you start working with conversions and all this type of stuff. But once you have those prices, you find yourself a friend who works in economics, who can crunch all this data and design things for you, right? So this is one place that I published this data set of information about New York slaves, which is also very useful. Somebody asked me about genealogy or individual studies of New York. If you have databases of 4,000 people, it really helps the historical societies and stuff look. Who was enslaved in my county? Or did anybody of this Spaniard something have a slave? And maybe it's in my database. All right? Now, economic historians studying slavery have looked for certain patterns in things. One of them is something like this, an age-price profile. So slaves are valued more when they're like 18 or 20 years of age. They're very less later in their life. And these curves, these value curves, it sounds terrible, right? Like, we're applying values, we're talking about people and numbers. And I've had to defend this a number of times because my response to this is the historian is not doing right. I think, again, we need to use every tool at our disposal to understand the past and how other people thought, And people in the past treated other human beings as numbers, as financial inputs. And we better understand the system if we don't neglect that part of it, right? So this is the traditional age-price curve that you see in the economic history textbooks talking about slavery. So I built one for New York. And you see it's much more, they call it like a Jabba the Hutt cluster. It's less of an accurate curve. It doesn't really fit that line very well. And the reason why, I think, is because, again, the type of work in New York was much more diverse. So if everybody's picking cotton, every 18-year-old is going to be very close to the same level of ability. But if you're in an economy that has lots of different types of skills, some semi-skilled, some low-skilled, some fairly well-trained, skilled people, you're going to have much greater diversity in the prices that those people are being sold on the market. Right? So that's one thing that's happening in New York. Another big part of the story, and one of the most interesting sources to me, is runaway slaves, advertisements in newspapers. I also counted these. I have 477 or something runaway slave advertisements from New York and New Jersey. I use New Jersey because it's a common market, and it helps me get the total numbers up so I have more comparisons. 477 slave advertisements in newspapers that say they ran away and they speak Dutch, or they speak some Dutch, or a little bit of Dutch, one way or another. And you can measure it by county, by time, you can cut it all these different ways and see these different patterns, which are really interesting. And I think maybe the one or two things I got from it that I thought was the most interesting was the number of Dutch speakers that were monolingual slaves. Because it'll come out right and say, slave run away, he speaks a little bit of English and some Dutch, or speaks bad English and good Dutch, something like this. And it's not from one place. These advertisements are saying that there's Dutch-speaking slaves running away from everywhere, from Albany to Long Island and Kinderhook. I don't know if you know your geography, but up and down the Hudson Valley, there's Dutch-speaking slaves in every one of these communities. Most of them are bilingual, but there are some monolingual ones, even in like 1810. But this is very weird to think that 19th century America, New York, has slaves, and they're speaking Dutch, and there's thousands of them, right? How is this not told? One reason why is the immigrants that came here in 1847 and after went through New York pretty fast. Talked to some old ministers there who still speak Dutch. All your cottages around here are named after these people because they donated to college. But they didn't remember the story. It was their grandparents that told them there used to be slaves around here. They didn't really talk about this. Their idea was New York slavery wasn't so bad. It wasn't so big. Right? But it's a lot bigger and badder than they remembered or knew about. Okay? All right. Let me hear. There's lots of other things you can do with economics or simple graphs and stuff, counting once again, to get a better understanding of the picture. One is to look at things in relative terms rather than absolute terms. And so if you look at these counties and how the population of slaves declined over time in the period of emancipation. So New York's emancipation starts in 1799 when they pass a law that says all children of slaves will be emancipated after they serve their masters until they're 28 if male, 25 if female. Later, 1817, they changed this to 21 years, and then in 1827, they ended entirely. However, if you were born in 1826 in New York, a child of a slave mother who was enslaved, you can be indentured, basically, a servant of that master for 21 years. So 1847, there's still people who are technically, in a weird way, enslaved in New York. Of course, some of them speaking Dutch. But if you look at this, you'll notice that on the left, the counties where the slave population is declining the fastest, if you know anything about New York, those are English-speaking counties. Where slavery is holding on the longest is in these really Dutch places. Orange, Ulster, Richmond is the old name for Brooklyn County. All right. A big part of this process, another thing that I've been pushing back against other historians on this topic, is about the role of negotiation. So ultimately, slavery in the North and in the South dies a political death. Right? We know this. It's eventually voted away. We fight a war about it and this. However, behind the scenes, just like the demography being behind the scenes, there is economic and what's it called? I'd say like physical confrontations of negotiation. So when the revolution comes through, there's this famous statement, why is, people pick on the revolution, why do we talk about freedom when we have slaves? How can we have this contradiction? People were aware of the contradiction, and it wore on them. And in this period, 1780s, 1790s, people in New York took this to heart, and their opinions started changing. I believe there was a change in sympathy and morality in New York in this period. Some of it is coming from liberal New England, the ideas coming down about slavery. Some of it's coming from the English Christian world, where people are starting to see others with more sympathy. One way that I think this happened, or I can attest to it, is in the court systems. You previously had the assumption that someone was a slave. By 1800, 1810, it starts to be, they're assumed free until they have to be proven a slave. The burden switches. Another thing that happens is the type of punishments. So in New York, our ancestors were much more violent than we are. Almost no matter where you came from, they were more violent. In 1730, for example, if you burned down a house or you raped a white woman in New York and you were an African American, you would be killed. But you would be killed by burning at the stake, cutting your hands off, sending your head on a stake. Sort of examples that were set for people. Over time, the number of burnings at the stake disappears, and you get hanging, which sounds pretty bad. Not as bad as being burned at the stake. Then, by 1800, 1810, you start getting life imprisonment for those types of things. So the punishments decline, the violence goes away, slowly, not entirely. The number of whippings probably decreases. And the reason why is because there's economic competition. The slaves in New York can run away. The Dutch slaves can run away to New York City, they can run to Canada, they can get on a boat, they can go somewhere else. It's harder to run away when you're in Alabama, right? And so what happens is the slave owners in New York start negotiating. They say, how about you don't run away? How about I sign an agreement with you that says you will work for me for another 5 years and then I will give you your freedom? So there's a lot of slaves in New York that buy their own freedom through work, that start, especially in New York City, getting some experience in actual free labor. They go out, they're allowed to sell their labor, and at the end of the year they have to come back and pay their slave. Think of this, you work all year and you come back and you just pay your slave, your owner for what work you've done. But this whole process has an element of negotiation that starts breaking down the system. Slaves are running away at greater rates, the courts are siding with them at greater rates, and after a while in New York, the slaves that are left are old. Because the children are no longer becoming slaves, they're being faded out of the system. The working age males are running away, 90% of the runaways are male. And so it becomes almost an economic burden by the end in New York. And that's when it disappears, when to do that. And so the whole point of this part of the story is that even though we look at the politics of it, there's always other angles that are contributing to it. Demographic changes. After I studied demography, I think about this all the time in our society, that the era of huge farms and 10-person children is over. We can't do that anymore, right? And there's a lot of demographic reasons why things change and contribute to change in our society. All right? Oh, so I don't know if you read this while I was talking, but this is one of these examples. Not only are they killed, they're killed dead. Right? You know, so it's really this emphasis on punishment. Another tool that I've used in my research is legal history. There's a website or a service called Westlaw. If any of you are lawyers or go to law school, you'll be familiar with it. My lawyer friends told me about it. And they said, this is a great research database. You can type in a word like Dutch, and you can get every court case in the United States and never mention the Dutch. And I'm like, that sounds fantastic. Let me take a look. It wasn't available for me at my university, so I emailed and then eventually talked on the phone to a representative from Westlaw. Talked to him for like 20 minutes. He was talking about how great it was, and I said, all right, let's do it. How much is it? He says $230 for a subscription. I'm like, that's great. For an annual subscription, that's not too bad. My department has money, they can probably pay me back for that. He's like, no. $230 a month. They sell this stuff to lawyers. Lawyers got no money on this thing. So I said, no, thank you. And a friend did the research for me and sent it to me. So I'm thankful it took a while. And then I discovered, like a year into this, that Harvard created something called the Case Law Access Project, which is basically the same thing, but now it's free everywhere. So you historians need to know about these different databases and type of research. I teach economic history at Georgetown. I teach people to read financial documents as historical sources. Like, I never would have thought of that, because I grew up as a cultural historian. I want to read letters and stuff. But if you learn how to read business history, you read those numbers and those types of reports. So the Case Law Access Project gave me all of the court cases in New York in which slaves were illegally being brought across state lines after emancipation, in which they had run away to Massachusetts and somebody was trying to bring them back, in which they had children whose status wasn't clear. And this tells a much different story than the traditional story. Because the traditional story is based on what's called statutory law. The statutes are those which the Congress or the executive passes and says, slaves shall not do this, or slavery shall be reinstated to the state. That tells you what's on the books. But what's really happening are the fights in the court. It's how the judges and the lawyers are interpreting the laws that matter just as much as what the laws say. And what I discovered is that over time, I call it the pendulum was swinging from slavery to freedom. Right? It's this gradual story of movement towards freedom. And you should really read some of the, if I had time, I'd give you some of the majority decisions of the courts in some of these things. These are extremely bright legal minds in New York in the 19th century. And the arguments they give are just fascinating, right? Because they're talking about freedom in really real terms, really raw, interesting terms, and why it matters and stuff. So that was a really interesting part of the story. So this is an example. There's not a lot of photographs of Dutch slaves because, photography didn't come along for another generation after slavery ended. But we have a few. And somebody asked me one time, we do all this with numbers. Where's the anthropology? Where's the people? And they're in the story. And I think, again, you can't tell the story of these individuals without the background picture. This one is Rosanna Rosberg. She's living in Albany. She's spent her entire life working for a white family. There's a sense in which it's not clear what status people had. So even though she was freed, where is she going to go? What is she going to do? Right? So she continues to live at the house of the people that had enslaved her before, even into like her 80s. This leads me to sort of some of my last chapters. What I wanted to do was measure the right to emancipation, like compared English and Dutch, trying to figure it out. And one of the questions, or if you look at some of these old books that have written on this topic, they say the Yorkers probably sold their slaves south in this period. And I thought, okay, maybe, can we know that? One historian said it was impossible to know. So that I had to try. And so again, I calculated every possible variable I could. Birth rates, death rates, the rates of population in different counties, where they might have moved to, the free population of blacks versus the slave population, trying to figure out where they all went. And in that demographic picture, how many could have disappeared and been sold south? And I do come up with a number. It's very vague, but I believe between 1 and 5,000 New York slaves were sold south in this period, and they mostly came from English-speaking areas, not Dutch-speaking areas, because again, the Dutch held on to their slaves. But in these last chapters, we're doing this stuff about demography again. I discovered something I thought was quite interesting that really sort of changed the picture for me. If you look at those census numbers, and remember the charts I showed in the beginning, those were the reported numbers from the census. And if you break it down, however, and look at the categories of the census, so this might be 1820 or something, and it's marking slaves, that census. It'll have what appear to be numbers in the 10 to 14-year-old category, or 0 to 14-year-old category. And like, wait a minute, there are no slaves under 14 years of age in New York in 1820. They couldn't be. Technically, legally, they ceased to be slaves born or imported into the state after certain years. What I discovered then is that the enumerators of the census were falsely recording children of slaves as slaves. They threw off the entire picture. 5,000 children were being recorded as slaves. Now, there were these servants that were kind of like slaves, but they weren't technically slaves. So that changes what's going on in the graphs. It means that slavery is declining faster in one sense, but it's also hanging on longer in another sense, if you consider this type of servitude in the form of slavery. Right? So sometimes there's a great story. I interviewed somebody in the 70s, and he said, lots have changed in your life. Did it get better or did it get worse? And he said, it got better and worse at the same time. Right? And this is kind of my report on slavery in New York, is that it was better and worse than you thought, because it was way different than you thought. Right? It's just a lot that people didn't know about the subject. And so I call these, I created this term, ghost tallies. You might see two numbers in here. If you want to confirm what the enumerator thought, you have to scan to the bottom of the page and see how they totaled them up. What happens is, you're walking around door to door with your booklet. How many people live here? Write it down, close the book. They always use a pen. The ink mark travels on the other page. And they all, back in that era, I write down ones pretty much straight up without a line or anything. All their ones in the era were angled. Like, almost all the people wrote their ones this way. And then you look at the enumerations, there's a whole bunch of them that are this way. They're bleed over marks. They're from back pages, they're from other pages. They're confused beyond belief. They all, and I've actually found this in other states as well. So our state totals for slaves, especially in places where they had these rules about children, are all confused. In New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all these other places. I call them ghost tallies. So this is the book with all those chapters put together. I got the painting from a guy named Len Tantillo. He's a famous artist in New York. Gave it to me for free. A great guy. And I think, so I had to rely on artwork for this because there are not a lot of photographs. And I think one of the big problems with these types of stories is that it doesn't fit our narrative and it doesn't have the traditional sources that we look for. As historians, it's very easy to go to the archive and ask at the National Archives for something, and they'll give you a collection that everyone has seen. Every historian has used the same Lincoln papers again and again. If you want to find really new stuff, you have to go to local archives, regional archives. You have to rat this stuff out. You have to dig really deep to find it. I remember going to archives and places in my life, and they say, yeah, we might have something on that, but they're kind of these unprocessed papers that are up in the attic that nobody looked at, and they're in a foreign language, you probably can't read them anyway. That's what I want to see, right? And so it's finding things that other people haven't found looking at them in different ways tells you a story that people haven't heard. The story of slavery gets incredibly affected by what's called the market revolution and the increase in the production of paper. So before 1820, not a lot of people are writing a lot. Then paper becomes cheap. Newspapers appear everywhere. You know, in the colonial period, there's only newspapers in a few cities. By 1820, like everywhere has a newspaper. At that point, slavery had faded out of the North. There's not sources writing about it. And all of the newspapers in the North are talking about how bad things are in the South. So we get this twisted idea that it was somehow good North and bad South. But they're obscuring their own slave history. And the Dutch in New York are doing the same kind of thing, and then it's not being passed over here. So the Dutch in the Midwest are like, we know nothing about this. We had nothing to do with this. I thought we were the good guys, right? We fought in the Civil War. Some of them did, that's another story. Some of them kind of supported the other side. Right Lennon, Brennan in Oregon, he came back after the war, so they didn't wipe him. And so, again, I think the exciting thing for me is to find things that are new. I don't want to write what I say is another biography of Thomas Jefferson. I want to write a story that changes the way we interpret part of history. So I think I'm close to an hour, right? Let me stop right there. Thanks.
We do have some time for questions. If people would like to raise their hands, I will come and bring a microphone to you. Hopefully it doesn't speak too much. And Michael.
Is that me or you?
I'll look over here. See if and so if anyone, I've got it.
I'm really limited to this spot. Yeah.
Michael, during your research, did you discover any contentiousness between Dutch people that were anti-slavery in the New York area? Was there anything like that?
Very little. So New York famously has this, what's it called? The New York Ammunition Society. It's a big deal because like Alexander Hamilton was supposedly a member and other people. But if you look at the list of the New York Ammunition Society, there's almost no Dutch names. There are the Dutch state representatives in that period. You can see what they're voting for and stuff. The Dutch ones from the Dutch colonies are all pro-slavery. And this continues like a generation later. They all vote Martin Van Buren. He's a Democrat, you know, but they're a Dutch leader. And so it's not too much later. Is Bill here? No. Bill Kennedy has written an article about the 1850s. The Dutch started thinking about this in the church, but before that, it's not really on their mind. There's no I joke about in the Netherlands, after World War II, everybody says that their family had been in the resistance. Because Dad was going to throw a stone at a Nazi once, right? Like he was a resistance leader. But at the time, the same thing in the United States. Abolitionists and anti-slave people were a minority, especially abolitionists. Those are the extreme form, right? There weren't very many abolitionists, but afterwards, in the history books, everybody wanted to be an abolitionist, and they're claiming themselves for it. I think most people just went with the flow. They're like, this is how it's always been. In fact, one thing that's curious is that the RCA ministers, a whole number of them were slave owners. And this was totally condoned. And the reason why is they needed somebody to tend the house and tend the farm so they could write their sermons for Sunday.
Another question.
Two questions, actually. First of all, do you have a sense for the origin of the enslaved people?
Yeah.
How they got here? Second question, do you know, were the enslaved people speaking Dutch in their quarters or only to their owner?
That's very, very, very good questions. There's lots of people that have done work on slave importation records. The earliest period, so like, for me, the earliest period, 1690, 1710, whatever, There's quite a few that are directly from Africa. In fact, there's a lot of Madagascar. And some of these New Yorkers are supporting ships that go directly to Africa and get people. A lot of those slaves that come over are speaking African languages, but they're also speaking Portuguese or Spanish, because the port cities in Africa are speaking Portuguese and Spanish. So it's a very multilingual world early on. And you see this in some of the reports. Later on, in the 1730s and 40s, is the peak era of slave importation into New York, and most of those are coming from the Caribbean. And so they've had a generation in the Caribbean. And so those, again, are speaking Spanish in many cases. I don't know if they're speaking African languages to each other. I think the Portuguese and Spanish fades away after a generation, and they learn either English or Dutch or both. But by the end of the 18th century, there are certainly communities of slaves in New York that are speaking primarily Dutch to each other in their slave cabins. And when slavery ends in New York, some of these African Americans, there's a book by David Stephen Cohen about going into the Ramapo Mountains a generation or two later, where there's still African Americans that speak from Jersey Dutch, what they call it. And so they're definitely speaking amongst themselves. However, because they're bilingual, when slavery ends, they can move off to cities and the language fades away. Dutch is also in that period a spoken language, it's not a written language. So the sources written in Dutch in New York pretty much fade out by like 1790. But there continue to be speakers of Dutch in New York, carrying on what they've learned from their Netherlands ancestors, all the way until the last ones, 1880, something like that. There's a lot of contention about that. But there's no clear point of demise of the Dutch language in New York. It fades from written to spoken to rural to just a few weird old ministers speaking it to somebody who remembers a few words from their dad. Right? It isn't just dad. Yeah. She's doing the hand, so I can't.
Not that you need more work to do, but just below New York is obviously Pennsylvania, and we think of Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yeah.
Your records were collected from New Jersey and New York. Any reason for excluding Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so the Pennsylvania Dutch and Deutsch are mostly German. There are a few actual Dutch in Pennsylvania, but it's a long, confused history about the word Dutch and Deutsch, but those really aren't the same people. Yeah.
As I mentioned to you earlier today, in New York State, simultaneously to slavery was the tenant contract system, and that was binding people in perpetuity to land, to own so much. They used it with weed, actually so many skipples of weed to the patroons, as well as some fat fowls and a day of labor in the manor. So when you look at New York State history, early history, was really very undemocratic. People were being tied up and bound in ways that you can't even imagine.
Yeah, this is, by the way, a renter. He's a New York archivist.
Yeah.
So he knows more about the papers than I do. Yeah, to answer your question, when you go to the colonial era, you have to think of the world as being hierarchical. The revolution introduces democracy. So the whole society switches from people having a position on the ladder that they determine where they are to being obsessed with equality. And that's sort of the crumbling of slavery, is getting rid of that hierarchy. And so, there's lots of arguments even among, there's an article by a Dutch immigrant in like 1861 that says, slavery's not so bad. I would rather be a slave in New Orleans than a factory worker in Liverpool or Manchester, England, right? None of them are selling themselves into slavery, right? They won't want that. It's a mistake to think that just because things are hierarchical, that they're all on similar status and level. Because it's more than just how much you're being fed or how nice your life is. there's an ethical part of you're not allowed to go anywhere, right? You're not allowed to be free. So freedom has a price. So
Now, did you look into the mechanization of agriculture and how it affected, since this is a wheat farm,
yeah,
1830, we're growing crop by acre, and shortly after minor, all of a sudden we don't need as much labor at harvest. Right?
yeah. Like if you look at cotton, of course, when you created the cotton gin, it actually increased the amount of slave production because the cotton gin got the bits out of the cotton. But now that you can process it so fast, you just get more people to pick it, and you can process it faster. The wheat industry, they start getting these like roller mills and water-powered and gas-powered mills. 1820s, 1830s, as it's expanding across New York State. And there's good research on this stuff. I just think it comes too late to really affect the story of slavery. Had slavery existed in New York longer, 1830s and 40s, that would have made, in fact, whether it would have meant more slavery or less is not always clear. Right? You can process the wheat faster to make more money, but maybe now you need more people to cut it down. Right? And this is again, the economic rationale doesn't stop slavery from being in the North. Slavery stops in the North because people stop accepting it, not because they're not making money.
Just want to see if there are any students who have questions, since we have any other students here tonight. Yeah.
Hi, so your big takeaway, it seems, is that Dutch slavery was a lot different from what all of us kind of expected it to be.
Yeah.
And I guess a question that pops into my mind when you say that is there that same sort of racial discrimination that we see, or at least a lot of us see in the South when it came to the aftermath of slavery? Is there a bunch of, I don't want to say programs done for Jewish immigrants, but are there events of anti-Black violence in those communities that you see after the slavery, or not after slavery, just after it becomes worthwhile?
Yeah. I don't know too much about that because it's not part of my research. It kind of stopped at 1827. But yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, we're not living in some racial equality world in the Northeast in 1840 or something like that. My brain was going a different direction because I thought you were going to ask more about the uniqueness of the Dutch slavery because you mentioned that. It's hard to distinguish between the Dutch and the English. Somebody earlier today, an altist, were asking me about this. A lot of historians call it Anglo-Dutch culture. And the truth is, in New York, I told you I had 4,000 slave sales or something. They're buying and selling slaves all the time, but I think even more than that, they're renting them to each other. Slaves become almost like communal property in a village. And when the slaves that are running away speak Dutch, they're not running away from Dutch-speaking masters. They're running away from English-speaking masters half the time, which means they grew up with a Dutch family, were sold to an English family, and they might be running back away to get away from them, or something like that. You can look at the last names, you can figure out who is Dutch, who is not. You can, of course, compare it with the South and the treatment of different people like this. But there is a distinct Dutch culture in New York in this period. They go to the Dutch church. They celebrate Dutch holidays. I didn't talk about Pinkster, which is the big African American festival among the Dutch in New York. They're speaking the language. There's a lot of indication to me from later sources that New Yorkers thought of Dutch New Yorkers as a separate people. They called them Knickerbockers. You have the Yankees, the Yorkers, and the Knickerbockers. And these are different people. So, yeah. Yeah.
Questions? I was fascinated by this talk. The sources that you kind of walk us through the sources was interesting, and I'm a fellow archive rat, so sorry. But it's said with affection. The work is incredible, and I really appreciate you coming.
I appreciate you breaking it. Yeah, thank you.
I I'm sure Michael will be here for a few more minutes if you
Yeah,
want.
I have some books for sale. I also have discount flyers.
Okay,
So
great. All right, yes, we have books available here, and I'm sure the author will send them to you. So let's think again.